that I did help write a book in the last year. Has anybody heard of the book?
Yes.
Back into so yeah, so I'm plugging it. I wrote it with Margaret Corabino, who's the co-author, and she's from the old Run magazine, so she helped me take the ramblings of a madman and turn them into the scribblings of a madman. So I'm really very appreciative of her for helping me to get down all the, and it's not even a true story arc. It's like my stories as I remembered them, and I was so afraid that I'm going to start forgetting these stories, so I just scribbled them all down. So that's, if that book acts like this big scribble pile, that's exactly what it is. So, but it starts out, my Commodore story, I didn't know about Commodore, but I knew about Atari, and I was saving my money for an Atari 400. I just love that color brown. I love the colors. I just, oh, it was everything. But it was so much money for an engineer back then. I was making all of $17,000 a year as a young engineer. And me and my boss weren't getting along, so a friend of mine, Hedley Davis, who went on to work at Commodore, he said, hey, there's this place hiring called Commodore, are you interested? And I said, yeah, you know, and I ended up there that night. I had car trouble. So I got there in like t-shirt and jeans. I think I had the clothes still in the tray. And when I say car, I mean an old '69 Ford van. But I got there, and they put me in this room with a guy named Frank, and I wanted to be liked so much, and I wanted to impress him so much, I tried too hard. I know I did. And I'm like, oh, I just blew this interview. So I meet with a guy named Bob Russell, and while Bob's talking and I'm not getting anywhere with him, he said, well, if you load accumulator, load X-Media at 09, and I mutter under my breath the opcodes for this, right? I'm like A209. He looks at me. I'm looking back at him, and he goes, store immediate 0506, and I'm like AD0506. So we're playing this game where I'm talking these opcodes. And he said, well, we'll have you come by the plant tomorrow. And I'm like, okay, cool. I've never seen where chips are made, right? Well, I don't know. I've been invited back for another round of interviews. So I get to the plant. I'm still, you know, the next day, I'm casual dressed for and long hair, right? Jeans, t-shirt. And I get there, and suddenly I see my first Commodore. A guy up-arrowed on a Commodore 64, changed the line and hit enter. And I'm like, oh my God, is that a screen editor built into this computer? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, oh, I want to work here now, thank you. And, you know, it's like, oh no, the kiss of death, now they're not going to hire me. So I talk with these people, Benny Prude and stuff. Oh, we had fun. I had a fun interview. There's no other way to put it. But then they like, okay, the last person you'll talk to is Shiraz Shivji, who went on to Atari. And so they put me in his office. Well, Shiraz's office was backwards from everybody else and faced out the window. And I'm like, oh, what a cool view. And I sit down in a chair and I'm looking out the window and I hear this voice, excuse me, you are sitting in my chair. And so now I'm like, oh my God, I've blown the interview again. It's like, what else could go wrong? So I'm talking to him and he's like, well, do you have a resume? And I'm like, I thought I was just coming to see a chip fab. I didn't know I needed a resume. Frank, the guy from the night before, goes, I have his resume. So suddenly he's my hero. And the bottom line was, I ended up talking with Shiraz, and they said something about what I worked on, which was digital scales. I came from making instrumentation. So, you know, Commodore computers are made very cheaply. I came from a place where we made stuff very expensively. It had to last. It had to work in conditions. And so Shiraz mentioned, or Frank mentioned this vibrating wire scale. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's the competition. They measured the reference weight of an object. They can tell the weight of an object by vibrating a string compared to a reference weight, and the frequency of oscillation tells you the weight. And Shiraz looks at me and he goes, you mean mass, not weight. I'm like, but I realized I had just been hired. You know, I had left my boss a way to correct me. And now he's my boss, and he's corrected me in my first. I'm like, cool, well, I can work here. Well, turns out I was hired as a technician, but before they gave me technician job, things to do. They said, no, you'll be working for Benny Prude, and here's this big old green and white listing. You're writing code for the new business hard drives. I'm like, cool, just want to work here, that's fine. Well, my first week there, I go wandering around. I look at the listing, and I do what I'm supposed to. But then I go wandering around, and there's these arcade noises coming out of the rooms. Well, it's all these people playing arcade games on their Commodore 64s. It's great. It's like, and you look in and you can't tell if they're working or playing because that's their job. They're trusted to be playing video games at work. Now, trust me, not everybody there was a good, programmer or hardware engineer, and we weeded through them, but it was a cool place. So I walk into the hardware lab, and I'm talking to a guy, and he's like, well, this is going to be our new computer. We're calling it TED. Does anybody know what TED is? What the TED computer series is?
Yep. Yes, we do.
What model computers do you think of when you think of TED?
+4.
116.
Like one of these?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yes. I love this little thing. I hate the keyboard. Let's get that out of the way. I hate the keyboard, right? But Shiraz goes, he pulls a Timex Sinclair out of the Commodore brand horizontal file cabinet. It says, this is what we're going to obliterate next. This is the enemy. And he showed a Sinclair. And so if this looks like the Timex color computer, there's a reason for it. But this case was designed by a guy named Ira Belinsky, who had done the Deck Rainbow. And this is beautiful. This is a work of art. The only issue people, look at that.
Hang on, your speaker went out. Power.
Hang on, we got power out on speaker. You may have to change it.
Bluetooth connected.
1, 2, 3, 4.
There we go.
Hey!
We're back.
All right. So this is the Raspberry Pi of its day. In fact, it's even got something the Raspberry Pi doesn't have, which is the power supply and a case and a keyboard to go with it, right? $49 this was meant to sell. So this is the original TED. And so I'm in the lab and I'm like, oh, are you doing that bus splitting technique where the video's on this portion of the time and then you're sharing it with the processor? That way they're both getting the memory at the same time. And he looks at me and he goes, how do you know about that? I'm like, well, I'm doing it at home. I've got a board I converted from Motorola to 6502. And trust me, I was a young kid full of, oh, I love this stuff. By the way, never been to college. Me and my high school don't exactly agree if I graduated or when I graduated. But I loved electronics. So, but the one thing that people did complain about this is, there's no room for Atari joystick ports. So the TED, we made a new joystick came out with this, and people hated that, but you can't get them all right? So this was the TED, this was the original computer, which is designed around a single chip computer processor called the TED. If you look, it's even bigger than our standard chips. It was our first time for using the 48-pin chip. And this computer was pretty much, I didn't do the hardware design on it. I was the lead hardware engineer, but I inherited the design. So there, in the book, you'll see all kinds of stories where we fix things, we figured out they're broken, we fix them. But one of my favorite stories is when I walked into the hardware lab, into the chip lab, my second week there, they're all there clustered around a microscope. I've got microscopes behind me, but these were nice microscopes, right? And they're actually looking at the chips down at the chip level. And the guy's like, all right, turn on the light of the microscope. And the TED chip turns itself into NTSC mode. There's like European mode and American mode for TV signals. And then he goes, okay, turn off the light. And I'm like, did you just use the light of the microscope to bombard the chip and make it change states? And he goes, yeah. I'm like, oh, I am working in the right place. This is so cool. So I don't know if y'all have ever seen a chip wafer. But I just found this. You're the first people to see this. I meant to show this on my webcast this week and forgot. That's a 4-inch wafer. 3, 4. That's a 4-inch wafer. This is from, I thought there's a date on here. This is from the 80s. This is to Don Black. So this was one of our CMOS chips we were trying to make in Costa Mesa. So, oh, by the way, I've proven these are glass, right? You know these things are made of silicon. Well, glass is silicon dioxide. We played Frisbee with these, and they shatter like these beautiful, charismatic things. I remember shaking it out of my hair and stuff, just these glass tinkles everywhere. They're like, when Bill Herd placed up throwing wafers down the hallway, you know, it was like a great place to work. So that's the first thing. So Jack Trammell had a concept / philosophy for the TED family. It was going to, we called the VIC-20. Oh, by the way, do you guys know about VIC-20?
Oh, yeah.
VIC-20, I'm back up a little bit. Cool machine, we called this the TI killer. If you remember the TI-99, this is one of its coffin nails in its coffin. This thing helped put it down. Yeah, so Jack, this was our TI killer. The Commodore 64, we called our Apple killer. Now, you may or may not believe it, but that's what we called it. That's why we thought of it, to the point where we had moved on, and this was going to be our Sinclair killer. So Jack's vision for this was a family of business computer that we had this low-end one, we had this medium one. Where'd you go? Oh, here. This medium one, which became the +4, but I knew this as a 264. This was a 116, this was a 264. And then there was a bigger one of these that's called a 364. And the 364 popped in 1980s. Now they did have some software talking programs. Sam, I love Sam. Hello, how are you? Everybody knew the voice of Sam. But we got the guys from TI Speak and Spell. We literally, I don't want to say shanghaied them, but we made them a good offer or something. We had the TI Speak and Spell guys came on, and we produced a speaking, I mean, we rented sound studios and everything to make the TED Talk. And TED had a desk, it's called Magic Desk. You may have heard the program that came out for the 64 and whatnot. But we were going to build it into the TED series, a talking magic desk where it would verify with you when you threw something in the trash, it would go delete file. And it was so cool for back in the day. So Jack had his vision. We had a new monitor called the 1801 or 1802. We had 2 new printers. And then a horrible thing happened. We're at the CES show in 84, 85, something like that. And Jack Trammell quits. And the TED family of computers lost its way, unfortunately. The 116 pretty much disappeared. You may have seen one, they may have sold a couple. Supposed to sell for 49, never happened. Then this was supposed to sell for $79. This would have sold for. This would have been a hit. It had 121 colors, it didn't do sprites. If you wanted to play games, get a Commodore 64. Jack figured out a way not to compete with the Commodore 64, in my opinion. And that was, it didn't do sprites, it didn't play games, it did have built-in sound, simple sound, and it had 121 colors. You could do beautiful documents. The demo scene for this is just, people have done fantastic stuff with this in the demo scene. So, and then I said 364. And then one day, this monstrosity arrived. It's a +4. This is my FCC version one, and it's my sample. This is a 1 of a kind or 1 of 20 or something. But it was a TED shoved in a VIC-20 or a Commodore 64 case. And I didn't care for this. I signed off on it. I'm the engineer, a record on the very top of it. Commodore Japan did the legwork for that. But then I learned to like it. About 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I started getting people telling me that their first computer was a C16. I'm like, well, how is that? And they're like, they were from Eastern Europe. Europe in general, Eastern Europe, the Balkan states. We had shipped truckloads out there evidently, and so a lot of people started on a C16. So I learned not to like it. I don't know another way to say it. But you know, when you make these things, when you design them, it's like heaving stuff over a wall. You have no idea what's going to work. And you almost can't bother yourself with it. What you can do is say, I want to make it as good as I can and still hit all my marks. I don't want it to be too expensive because I made it better. I don't want it to be a cheap piece of poop either, you know? So you do the best you can, but at the end of the day, it's like a movie that gets released. Either it does okay or it doesn't. And we just didn't worry about it. We would move on to the next project. So, now, you all know this one, right? Commodore 64. Woo! Highest selling home computer ever. In the Guinness Book of World Records for 27 million. I don't know that I believe that number anymore. I've been reading a lot of and seeing a lot of things, but it's certainly more than 12 million. So we sold between 12 and 27 million. Still way more than if you combine all the Apple models together. I had never met Albert Charpentier, the designer of this, till 6 months ago. And we spent 6 hours just talking, just on the phone, an hour at a time going, well, how'd you start it? Where'd the colors? So I'll try and channel you guys and say, you know, this number one question that I used to hear is, where did the colors come from on a Commodore 64? And the reality is, or the history is, that Albert started as a ROM designer in making ROMs at MOS, and he wanted to make a video chip, and they're like, well, why should we trust you to make a video chip? You don't have any video chip experience. And so he breadboarded the original VIC chip. I said we're having a power issue?
No, not a power issue, just the 30-minute Zoom limit. So,
Okay.
So when it cuts off, then I've set up the next meeting, so we'll just go back into the second meeting. So just talk until it shuts off.
And I've never seen the Zoom limit actually limit, so we'll just, are we? Oh, is it coming up?
Yeah, I think it's got five more minutes.
Wow.
They're pretty
All right. So, but what Albert did was he prototyped the VIC chip on a printed circuit board. He makes it sound like it's about this big. Picture that. In the 70s, early 80s, 81, 82, he made a VIC chip, and he made it work. And the night it worked, he made color at 11 o'clock at night, he said, which is so Commodore-ish. I mean, it's like I probably knew the room he was in when he did it, right? So the colors are made by combining two sine waves together, and you get a vector addition. So if you have half of this, you get 45 degrees if they're 90 out of phase. That's what he would do, is it's called a color wheel, and he would turn this color. He made those colors with resistors based on this prototype, and so he did get a chance to actually tweak and go, oh, that's a shade of green I like. But it all came from a prototype. So that's one of the big questions we get is, where did the colors come from? What's the thing you hate most about this Commodore? I'll go ahead and ask that. Go ahead and it's a loaded question. What's the worst thing about Commodore, these computers?
Rob, what do you think?
Serial disk access.
Serial disk access. Gee, have you heard the story why it's so blank and slow?
Some of it.
Heard a version of it?
Okay, so I know the full story. Originally, there was supposed to be a hardware shift register in the 6521, 6526, 6526 chip, where you just give it a bite and he goes, oh, pump, 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 out the door, right? It's his job to shift it out. That's why it's called a shift register. And then on the inside, coming in, they go, pump, 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 pump. Here's a byte for you to read. So you'll notice I'm missing a finger, so that's supposed to be like 8, but it's not, it's 7. I'm missing, my parity's broken. So or actually I'm forced parity, right? 7 bits. But the hardware shift register had a problem that when you went from input mode to output mode, a glitch would go out the line. A charge had built up on this floating node, it's called. So it's like, I can hear you, I can talk, I can hear you. But when you go to talk, it'd be like, flat. Okay, I'm talking now. But everybody froze on the line. But we caught it. We caught it. We knew it did it. We said, okay, in the answer to part of it was, or the urban legend that we had is, Jack basically puffs his cigar and says, Jack Jamel, here's where the working unit will be sitting Monday. And so Bob Russell works the weekend to make a software shift register work, right? And that means the processor sits there and watches the line goes high, and he watches it, the line goes low. And meanwhile, he's trying to do some other things. And meanwhile, the system architecture is getting involved. And it was slow on the VIC-20, but when we went to the Commodore 64, it got slower because the Commodore 64, the VIC chip, has these big spaces of time called DMA, direct memory access, where he says, you can't do what you want to do. I need to do what I want to do so the screen looks pretty. So now the serial bus is even slower. But wait, we almost had a chance to fix it. Bob had routed the lines to the working shift register on the printed circuit board. So we could do either the slow software one or the fast hardware one. And Commodore